first.
Okay.
We've seen, a reaction this week from China on the US strikes on Iran. What's your view on how that escalating situation in the Middle East is going to affect the global economy, particularly oil prices?
That's a very good question, which falls exactly outside my expertise. But in general, I think what we're seeing at the moment is rising uncertainties. We are very much worried about deglobalization, trade protectionism, and so on. But I think the factor really hurts sentiment and economic outlook really is uncertainty. So I don't exactly know what this conflict is going to have, but obviously it's going to have some impact on the oil prices, which will again have implications for inflation outlook globally. Where it will head to, it's a bit hard to expect at the moment. I would just say on China, the Chinese economy is so far doing pretty well. Our guess is that the second quarter GDP will still be above 5%, which means the first half will be okay. But it faces lots of uncertainties. We still face a property sector which is still undergoing some adjustment at the moment. And we obviously also face very uncertain outside world. In fact, if you look at the first couple of quarters, and you find some of the real indicators like exports and production and so on, they're doing reasonably well. And so I think the economic activity as a whole still remain quite resilient, partly just to reflect the policies the government introduced, especially on consumption. But if you look at a number of other indicators, I think we should be mindful of the potential risks, possibly caused by uncertain environment. So for instance, PMI has been in the below 50 area for 2 months. CPI is slightly negative at the moment. You look at the private sector investment and also the unemployment rate. These numbers look relatively weak. So I think we need to watch out what happens in the coming quarters. On the one hand, it really depends on what happens to the global economy and the policy environment, the U.S. trade policy and the conflict you just mentioned. But at the same time, I'm sure the Chinese government will probably take further actions to just make sure the resilience of the economy continues.
Paul, what's the view from the U.S.?
The view from New York. Well, thanks very much for having me here. Let me agree with Yiping off the bat. I think the conflict with Iran and Israel just adds to uncertainty. Uncertainty has been the theme this year. It's mostly been trade policy uncertainty coming out of the U.S. But we haven't seen the global recession that a lot of people were forecasting. We definitely see activity slowing down, and that kind of makes sense, right? If you've got a high level of uncertainty, firms are reluctant to invest, consumers are reluctant to spend. We've seen some closure in markets like M&A and some of the spec grade markets that we follow at S&P Ratings. In terms of the U.S., we had a lot of crazy numbers in the first quarter as people tried to get ahead of the tariff. So in the U.S., we had this surge of imports, which actually dragged GDP growth negative for the quarter. It was 0.2 in Q1, but we think a lot of that's going to reverse. The U.S. is tracking 3 to 4% positive growth in Q2. So if you take those together, growth is kind of 1.5 to 2. So we're slowing from last year. It's certainly not a disaster. And then other countries, China, maybe Ireland's an interesting example that we're trying to front run the tariffs with exports. They had a boost to growth. But I think to wrap that up for us, it's really all of this uncertainty around policy, which is kind of pushing down growth. And until we get some relief and some clarity on U.S. tariff policy, I think those downside pressures are going to continue.
I mean, just coming to the trade war, which has de-escalated slightly in the last month. We have this kind of fragile truce currently struck in London this month between Washington and Beijing. Santi, can I just come to you and ask your view on, it's a difficult question, whether you expect that truce to last?
Well, yes, another difficult question fall right outside my expertise as well, just to quote Prof. Huang. But I think It marks, I think, I agree with both speakers, that it marks shifts in the thinking, coming from the policy investment kind of perspective. We're shifting from the kind of just-in-time economy to just-in-case. We're shifting to the world where base everything on efficiency to optionality and security. And that means this is going to be a period of prolonged uncertainty that we have to live with. It's not going to be a period of uncertainty, volatility, whereby some negotiations get done by early July and then we have certainty. No, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be extended even where the agreements have been achieved. It's more of a framework to continue to negotiate. So there's been a lot around uncertainty in trade policies that drag on, I think, months, years. And I think another important shift that we have to look at, especially as smaller countries, small open economies, is that you want to look at the second round impact of this as well. Most of the focus right now is really on how much your tariff is going to be, who's going to get a better deal, and whatnot. But later on, there's going to be a second round impact of this, where every country adjusts to the new trade environment, trade regime. What that means is if you look at the US, which I think accounts for something like 15% of global imports, right? If there's demand in the world is smaller, then there's going to be extra capacity products, glut, that need to find some market to go. So everyone's going to be looking for new markets. Everyone's going to be finding a place where they can export their products and dump on some of this extra capacity. So there can be flooding of goods. On one hand, it's going to be positive for the consumers because things are going to be cheaper from consumer products to commodities. On the other hand, the SME is going to be badly affected because the margin is going to get squeezed. And this is second round impact of greater competition that's happening more generally that you have to watch out for. And this is going to drag on as well as firms adjust. So you can't just look at the first round impact, which there is already a lot of uncertainty, but there's added layer of the second round as well.
Aparna, if I could come to you and just switching from an economic lens to more of a business one, and we've heard about SMEs there. Singapore's really, in the heat of the action in terms of trade, in terms of business. What is the view from Singapore on this de-escalation in the trade war?
No, absolutely. I think a few things too. So first, to connect to what Santi just said, I think one of the learnings of the last 1 month has been that the two top economies of the world are more codependent than we imagined. And I think that's a good thing. So the business community is looking at that with happiness. To say that China and US are actually more dependent on each other than we thought. There are multiple points of dependency, not just on trade, and that means that both sides have a need to find a resolution, have a need to find ways to work with each other. So that's good news. I think from the business community, and I think Singapore is I would say I use as a surrogate for a neutral third party looking upon global affairs, and that also is true for most countries of the global south. There's 130 countries of the global south, all of whom didn't create any of this, but are obviously living in a context that is determined by multipolarity. So for them, I think there are possibilities for caution, and there's a lot of volatility to navigate. There is need to make sure that the countries are pro-business, and the governments in particular are making pro-business policies and internationally leaning policies so that growth can continue. On the other hand, there's also opportunities for the countries and the businesses. One big area of opportunity is the global south itself. There are 130 neutral countries that are willing to do business across geopolitical fractures and are open for business. And many of them are run by leaders who are, relatively speaking, internationalists. So I think I do look forward to opportunities in the global south. I do think that businesses are going to go through several years of negotiation. This is not something that's going to, anyone who's done any kind of trade negotiation will tell you that a trade deal can't happen in a week or a few months. It takes several years, and that's why multilateralism exists, because these things are so painful to do. So businesses are waking up to the fact that this is the norm, this is how things are going to be for the next 4 to 8 years. We need to plan for it, and they are investing behind capabilities there. Investing in trade compliance capability, investing in people who understand customs and border control and legal and regulation, and are able to navigate and even lobby with governments to sort of get the right business context. So many changes going on.
Thank you for that. Paul, just to come back to the problem of economic forecasting, difficult at the best of times, and particularly difficult this year, as we all know. Even if we do have a truce that lasts between the US and China, we do have this environment under the second Trump administration with higher tariff rates. It looks like globally we have July the 9th, a big deadline for this 90-day pause. how is the global economic outlook going to change against that backdrop?
Yeah, well, forecasting has become slightly difficult, to make an understatement, this year. We've basically kind of given up forecasting on the back of every policy announcement, so we've moved to ranges. But it's really a view, you know, if you're looking out, let's say 3 to 5 years, which is the forecast horizon for us, you really need to take a view on whether the tariffs are a feature or a bug of this administration, right? Is it going to be constant negotiation, and is this uncertainty going to be overhanging? Or are we going to get some sort of resolution and people will be able to make longer term decisions? I think we're leaning a little bit toward the former camp, but you know, again, it's not necessarily a recession or a downturn, but we have the US, just as an example, starting the year with growth close to 3% and ending the year with growth close to 1%. So it's a slowing, and central banks are going to be cutting rates, continuing to cut to you know, try to ease conditions. But it's really the question of the longer term, what are tariffs going to be, to the points over here, how are global supply chains going to adjust? That's a multi-year complex thing. We left globalization behind. I'm a former IMF employee, so we all liked globalization. We're not sure where we're going and what this new configuration looks like. So as a forecaster, unfortunately, you've got to put all that together in a medium-term view. Maybe just to wrap up and say the confidence bands around our forecast are slightly larger than they normally would be in calmer times.
Yeah, on the general challenge of forecasting, I should add at this point, we have extended this panel by 15 minutes, so that should... 30 minutes wasn't quite enough to solve all the problems in the world. And we're looking forward to your questions at the end as well, so please do have a think about those. Huang Yiping, I'd just like to come to you on a slightly different question, and the question of fiscal policy globally. We see a lot of pressure on China internationally for more stimulus, and you know, I mean, it's always difficult to generalize, but there does seem to be some expansive fiscal pressures globally. How does that factor into the way you see coming years?
Well, my view about the fiscal policies, you needed to divide up for the short-term purpose and the longer-term purpose. For the longer-term, economists have kind of like a view that you need to discipline the government, because otherwise you're going to face some sustainability question. I think many countries in the world face this problem. But if you are in a crisis or in a near-term significant downturn, especially, I mean, you probably could include a situation like today, if whatever outside uncertain factors cause downturn of the domestic economy, I personally would be very much in favor of active fiscal policy, because only if you try a fiscal policy expansion, you can stabilize the economy. You could actually, in turn, to have the room to restore the fiscal health. So at the moment, this is not something that I would worry too much. But the longer term, you need to be careful. If the government runs out of the capacity to repair the damage, then it will have a huge negative impact on the economy. I mean, some of you probably noticed around the end of September last year, our fiscal policy turned much more aggressive. I mean, before, we always used this term, so-called proactive fiscal policy, but the actual stance or actual position was much more prudent, meaning some officials or experts were probably less willing to be more aggressive on expanding the fiscal policy. But things turned, I think, during the fourth quarter of last year, and that's partly why the economy turned around quite drastically. So I think there is still room for fiscal policy expansion, but the longer term, obviously, we still need to be mindful about fiscal health.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the question of fiscal policy, Aparna, how do you see fiscal policy in terms of the business outlook? Is an expansive fiscal policy environment good or bad for businesses globally?
So I think businesses are expecting to lean on economic statecraft to a certain extent. I'll expand it even beyond fiscal policy. So economic statecraft was something that was over the, 30, 40 years of globalization that we had, was slowly on the downswing, because the idea was that governments provide an environment where businesses can thrive, and that's good. And of course, business and government have a relationship and a partnership, but governments don't need to dictate the context too much. Lately, everywhere in the world, and I know US gets a lot of messaging around that, but all around the world, economic statecraft is on a rise. That means governments are intervening not just with fiscal policy, but with incentives, with investment screening, with giga incentives to drive tech, AI, etc., and of course with tariffs. So economic statecraft is on a rise. Now, businesses are in a range of spectrums, and obviously, as all business leaders, if it suits you, then you're all praises. If it works against you, then you want to make it stop, right? So that's just how businesses think. But overall, I think businesses in Europe as well as across the global south are asking governments to do more to help them be competitive in this environment. And so even in Europe, if you look at the Draghi report, the discussion was around investing more to drive innovation, to drive technology superiority in AI, and really help catch up, Europe to catch up. Second, businesses are asking for simpler regulation. Now, that's a tough ask right now, because if I was predicting, I'd say in general, the world is going to more complex regulation, because tariffs require countermeasures and measures and exemptions, and that makes more paperwork. But businesses are asking for relatively simpler regulation to the extent they can. Third, local businesses in local markets in India, in China, in Europe are saying, help me compete globally. And so governments are going to spend more to provide those type of incentives. So that's how businesses are coming at it. They don't like much regulation, but they are leaning on economic statecraft because the world is getting harder to compete, especially for a global company.
Santi, you've got
if I like to perhaps connect the two questions that you asked, because I thought it's really interesting question. I think on the first around the forecast, which is linked to the second part actually, is that because the forecast sometimes, we're in a period where it's so hard to make this point forecast, what GDP is going to be and so on and whatnot. Sometimes it's actually easier to look beyond that, because we know it's kind of broad contour, like where the world is going, where potentially the big themes are at play. So perhaps it's hard to tell what GDP is going to be, but you can get a pretty good idea that perhaps the AI transformation is going to be an important part of the economy. You know, the climate change is going to affect a lot of economy. You know, inequality is rising in some parts of the area. And when you know all those goals, that's the way you can set strategy and policy. And it comes back to the question of fiscal policy. Is no longer just a tool for short-term stimulus, but you also have to think about quality, not just quantity. How can we spend fiscal policy to address some of these future needs? Are we spending it on roads to nowhere just to stimulate the economy? Or are we spending to build infrastructure so that we become more climate resilient? Are we spending on reskilling, upskilling to help people benefit from AI and digital economy more? Are we spending to build infrastructure to less connected area, underserved areas? Because these going to create extra capacity, productivity in the long term. So I think that's increasingly the lens the policy is going to be judged. It's not only just a short term to get by, but if we are entering a new world, how much of these policies and spending is really towards readying the countries, the organizations for the future.
If I could just come back to you, Santi, on one follow-up on that. We've talked about the economy, we've talked about businesses. Just to come to the markets, we've seen a huge amount of volatility this year in financial markets. They may be acclimatizing to a new era of higher underlying volatility, but I'm just wondering how relevant their movements are to this challenge of putting together an outlook for the economy here. Do you look closely at the gyrations in the markets and base your outlook on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the near-term volatility, the spikes, I think as Paul said, become part of the norms now. That it's just much more uncertainty, and it's beyond volatility. It's more uncertainty. So some of this is unprecedented. Some of this we are entering the realm where we don't know what is the risk, what is the probabilities as well. So that's why the optionality become really important, because you want to have the flexibility to move around. And again, we are in a world where I think it's less important to be right, but more important to not be wrong for too long. You want to be stuck in a period where you're stuck with the wrong forecast or wrong scenarios of the world for too long. That means you shouldn't be too gung-ho to fixate on some ideas and be able to move fast. But at the same time, you also have to balance and make sure that this volatility in short term, which drive big movements, doesn't blind you for what's the long-term transformation that's going on. I think that's going to be very important as well, because we talk about the second round impact, we're talking about the long-term transformation. If we are just too busy putting out fire, then we're not really thinking enough about how to build the new house for the new world.
And just to ask you, Yiping, on the China context there, I remember April, the first week of April, we had a significant fall in the stock market in China. And then we saw that the market stabilized, and we saw a lot of quite open, actually unusually open statements from government institutions on the need to stabilize the market. How does that fit into the question of market volatility? We've seen maybe less volatility in China.
Well, I think the government certainly played a significant role, but I think the main reason is related to uncertainties. I mean, we all know why the market became so volatile in early April. But what followed now, on the one hand, as I said, the second quarter GDP economic activity looked pretty resilient, whether you look at the real indicators and so on. So that, on the one hand, certainly calms down the market and the economy. At the same time, we are seeing some progresses in negotiation between the two countries. We don't exactly know yet how it will play out, but I think the market participants start to feel that there is a hope that we'll see some kind of agreement in the coming months. On the other hand, as we economists always say, bad policies are very bad, but uncertainty is even worse. So I think if we make significant progress in negotiation and settle on something, eventually I think the market can absorb.
Thank you.
Can I jump
Paul,
in?
please.
I think that, to that point, the markets actually play an important role in all of these tariff negotiations that are going on.
True.
We've seen very clearly that when the tariffs are announced, the markets tank, and then when the tariffs are paused, the markets go up. So if you think of the markets as kind of big information and opinion processing machines, they're sending information to policymakers, and I think it's pretty fair to say the U.S. government is at least partially reacting to what's going on in the marketplace. So, that's part of this mix of the policy, the market reaction, and everything else. And that's, in a way, kind of steering the result. Hopefully we get to a good result where we get some stability around tariff policy. But there's a really important role for the markets to play here.
I remember an American friend once said to me that the stock market is China's biggest ally.
The U.S. stock market.
In this game. Okay. In this game.
Just clarify that.
Yeah, the U.S. stock market is China's biggest ally in this policy game.
I just want to pick up, Paul, on something you mentioned earlier in passing, but it was a very important point on globalization being dead or changing, not being what it once was. Can you expand a little bit on that? I mean, I think, just to come back to Aparna's point, we have seen perhaps some evidence with this truce that the forces of business and the forces of the markets do seem to have proved quite resilient to the pressures from governments. To what extent are we actually seeing an unwinding of globalization, and to what extent are we seeing a political projection of that unwinding that doesn't materially change the underlying structures?
Well, we certainly don't think globalization is dead. Let me just give you one very concrete example. I was in Washington in April for the IMF World Bank spring meetings, and the U.S. has, let's be polite, mixed feelings these days about globalization, but the rest of the world continues to be all in, whether you're talking to Europeans, you're talking to the Chinese, or you're talking to countries from the global south. So although the country that helped set all of this up is having maybe second thoughts, the rest of the world is all in on globalization. And to Aparna's point, the U.S. and China are very interconnected. But that being said, to go back to my previous comment, we don't know exactly where this ends up. If you read some of the things coming out of the new U.S. administration, that's not necessarily against globalization, but there's a view that the U.S. provided or has provided these public goods for decades, whether that's the security umbrella or the role of the dollar or the role of the U.S. Treasury, and the U.S. hasn't been fairly compensated for all of that. That's a sort of short version of the current U.S. administration view. So the rest of the world needs to in some way compensate the U.S., whether that's higher defense spending in Europe or tariffs on other folks. So the U.S. administration's been pretty clear. I think Secretary Bessent said America first doesn't mean America alone. So they're supporting the bank and the fund, but it's going to be different from what we've seen in the last couple of decades. And again, to what we've been discussing on this panel, we're not sure where all of this is going to land. We do know it's going to be more uncertain, a little bit more expensive. There's going to be redundancy. Supply chains are going to have to overlap. There's going to be more inventory. Everything's going to be a little bit less efficient than it used to be, but I think we're still going to be in a globalized world.
Could I add to that?
Please.
So the reason I felt compelled to add is I run the globalization practice at BCG, so every day we're like, is the practice relevant? It's an important question, existential for us, right? For us for 15 years. But my view is, I think globalization will remain, but the blueprint is going to be completely different. The blueprint that companies used to become multinationals in the past is no longer how it's going to be. So a few things, right? One, on trade, we did a few medium-term scenarios because, Paul, like you, we wanted to step out of this, what's going to happen tomorrow, to say what might happen in 2 to 3 years. We think the world is going to come into either a global managed trade or a multipolar trade world, right? Where you'll have a series of, almost a patchwork of bilateral, multilateral, regional treaties, and businesses are going to have to navigate around it. So that means businesses can still do trade across boundaries, but will need to learn how to navigate more complex regulations than what the WTO had set up over the last several years. So they need to have the muscle to do that. Second, you cannot have the same operating models that you used to have in the past. So MNCs are coming to realize that across multipolar fractures, they can't operate the same thing. They need to think about the role of the center versus what the countries are empowered to do. They need to think about how they use local partnerships to get the license to operate in certain countries. They also need to have a way by which they can set up technology and infrastructure across these fractures. So I think globalization will continue. The businesses and most countries of the world are deeply committed to globalization, and they get their license through economic growth, which is connected to globalization. So governments want it. But businesses are going to learn to have to operate across countries in a completely different way. So the old template won't work and a new playbook is needed. And I think that's the tension that we are seeing right now.
Santi.
Just weigh on this question. I think I have this hypothetical kind of scenario, situation. I think if you talk about Southeast Asia and I think many parts of Global South, and you ask the firms which are already global, what's happening in globalization? They might say, yeah, it's in a retreat, it's been weakening over time. But if you ask the ones who are more domestic players in the past, who is not already a global company, they may actually say it has intensified. Because if you're Southeast Asian companies, your consumers inside, you're seeing a redirection of many products from outside, imports are coming in to the dynamics I was talking about earlier as people were trying to find new markets. A lot of these products flood in, so, you definitely be buying from the world more. If you are people, you definitely see rise in tourism coming back from COVID, and I think tourism recovery has been as strong as ever right now in the region. You are seeing a lot of capital that being redirected, a lot of foreign direct investments, part of this so-called China +1, China +2 theme in Southeast Asia, new factories being set up, new funds being set up, new business offices, talents are coming in. These are things that they've never really seen in the past because Southeast Asia weren't perhaps most prominent on the map. But now they're kind of rising to more prominence, they're getting more, they're in the spotlight. So for some people, they would say, actually, for me, globalization has intensified. I never really felt it that much back then. Now I'm feeling it even more. So I think that dichotomy is very interesting to pan out.
An interesting perspective is where we look at globalization from. It might look different from different locations. I just want to, we've got a few minutes remaining. I'm wondering if there are any questions in the audience. If there are, please do raise your hand. We have one over here. And if you could just say your name and
thank you for the
question.
opportunity. I'm with Caixin Media. I'm a journalist with Caixin Media. So my question is regarding the Chinese economy. For the past year, there's a lot of discussion that one of the major reasons that China's economy is slowing down is because there's not enough demand, that the Chinese people doesn't consume much. That kind of become a mainstream opinion. But lately, I've seen a lot of debate on this question on consumption as to how to measure the consumption level. What is the right index to measure consumption level, and how much that the Chinese consumption level is underestimated. I think Professor Huang must be familiar with this. So my question is whether, I mean, how much China needs to consume more?
Well, I read the articles, a couple of articles, and I think there was a good point in the sense that some of the consumer spending items were not appropriately valued, and others were probably not incorporated in statistics, which probably means the official consumption ratio at the moment is a bit underestimated. But I would argue, and I think most of these authors also agree, that we still have an underconsumption problem, partly because you just show the overall problem we face, challenge we're facing is we produce more than we consume. So whether that's sufficient or not, I think that is an issue we needed to rebalance. So this is why I think boosting consumption is still a big challenge, partly because the global external market is less open as before. But we should also recognize that China now is a large country. For a large country, you can't continuously export your excess capacity, which means that's why I think the policy priority now is first to focus on domestic circulation. So I think these authors, I mean, the pieces of evidence provided were pretty convincing, but that doesn't change the story that we still needed to consume more to bring a more balanced economic structure.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions in the front here.
Hi. Thank you. My question goes to Yiping and Paul. Given the ongoing trade tensions, how do you see Chinese and US capital markets reacting in the short term and long term? And as entrepreneurs and global investors, how can we effectively manage the risk posed by trade conflict while also considering the impact of fiscal and monetary policies and the long-term potential of AI as a new driver of productivity? And as we approach the US midterm elections, do you expect—
That's a really complicated question.
Just a follow-up. And as we approach the US midterm elections, do you expect the trade tensions between the US and China to ease? Or will this conflict continue to shape capital markets and global trade in the near terms? And additionally, do you think China will accelerate its pace of opening up to the global market in response to this dynamic?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to pick one question from those five, and I'm going to redirect this. I'm going to redirect this to Paul because he's flown in from the US. The US midterm elections. I mean, the US elections are always very significant. Paul, what do you think about this question about US midterm elections?
Yeah, well, the rule of thumb in the US is that the party in power usually loses seats. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, the midterm elections usually have some rotation away from that party. I'm not making a forecast about what happens next November, but the economy is also important, right? So if the economy is still doing well, maybe that reversal effect is weak, but if the economy starts to really go south, we get a bit more. But right now, the sort of general thinking in the US is that the lower house, House of Representatives, might flip to the Democrats in the midterm. But that's, you know, kind of a guesstimate at best.
Yeah. If I could add a bit to that, because I spent a lot of time as part of my remit in the US thinking about US policy and especially trade policy. So yes, there might be some shifting towards the Democrats. I don't expect a blue wave in the midterms. I mean, I spend a lot of my time in the US market, and I just don't see a popular dissent against where the government is going. You know, I know it's not a great answer, but the reality is that there's a lot of support for these policies. There is a lot of grassroots reaction that led to these policies, and the government is coming with a mandate to deliver that. And now, some of us may agree with it, some of us may not. Not all American citizens agree to it, but the truth is that there is a backing of an ideology which has led to this policy, which has led to the economic aspects. So I don't expect a massive swing. And I do think that overall, if you, you know, right before the US election, we prepared 6 policy levers. And we said that if there is a Trump administration, these are the 6 policy levers that we expect to happen. That's the one page we have not had to change since the beginning. And that page was written 9 months before elections. this administration has been on message, and they've said this in the campaign. So we have to acknowledge that there's a direction that is more broad than what a midterm swing, etc., might go. There's a big direction that the US is taking, which we have to assume it's going to stay for the next few years.
Thank you. Maybe a question from this side of the room.
Thank you. This is a question from South China Morning Post. So this question, I think, goes to Paul. So how do you view the future economic landscape between some superpowers, especially China, US, and the EU, as we are now seeing a temporary truce in the Sino-US trade tension, while the EU is now restricting Chinese companies from major public medical equipment purchasing contracts? And that's after the hawkish remarks made by its chief official of EU in the G7 summit. So I'm just wondering, how do you view the future development between the economic ties between the three superpowers? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to give you a short answer. At a very high level, the US, China, and the European Union are kind of the three poles of the global economy. They're all roughly 20% of global GDP. With the US at least partially pulling back, it's an opportunity for Europe. And we mentioned the Draghi report already, and we have the release of the German debt brake, where we're going to see more expenditure around infrastructure and defense. So the question is, there's an opportunity for the European Union to kind of lift its game, maybe do some capital market reform and get the euro more on a par with the dollar. But there's kind of a structural opportunity for Europe here, and I think we've got that partially built into our forecasts, and a lot of luminaries have been writing about this. But I think that's a super interesting structural issue to watch over the coming years.
Could I just come to you, Santi, on that question as well? I mean, Southeast Asia, there's been some indication that economies there might have benefited from these tensions between the US and China in some respects. How do you see that developing?
Yeah. So I think that has already been true for the past kind of 5-6 years already, and I think it's probably going to continue. That you see a lot of this kind of shift in globalization, both in trade, in capital investments, in talents coming to Southeast Asia as a region. And also in many ways, this geopolitical environment are bringing these countries closer together as well in terms of collaboration. So I think that is likely to continue. It would change somewhat depending what the final tariff numbers look like. But I think generally the region is on the spotlight more than ever. But there's kind of pros and cons of this. On one side, you're getting more capital, you're getting more talents. On the other side, there's also greater competition for the resources, for the people, for the markets inside the economy. And if I could also add to the Europe piece just now, I think the reconfiguration of the global alliance is going to be very interesting as well, because I think it's an important opportunity for Europe, as you have mentioned. And this is a time when you also find the unlikely alliance or non-traditional alliance. You can see greater collaboration, integration, and trade pacts coming, for example, if between Asia, Southeast Asian economies, and Europe, we're coming closer together. That's going to form pretty big markets. Things like this may not happen normally, but in this situation, anything is possible. So I think that's another exciting area, but you start to see this new kind of growth engines coming together.
Thank you very much. Not to put too much pressure on the audience, we've got time for a couple more. Has anyone got a question about something we haven't talked about yet? Not related to US, China, not related to any of these topics. Put your hand extra high if you do, maybe at the front here.
Thank you so much. And I have two questions for you.
Just one, I'm afraid.
Okay, sure.
I'm going to have to ask you to pick the best one.
So traditionally, especially for those export-oriented countries, they use the strategies such as building coalitions, diversifying their trading partners, or establishing the new international or intergovernmental organizations to address the problems of protectionism. But do you see there is a new trend, or there are any innovative way for you to address the protectionism, and if there is any change in the trade negotiation strategies facing the protectionism now?
Aparna, perhaps I could come to you on this.
Yeah. So I would actually say there's a bigger bucket than protectionism, which, as I mentioned earlier, is economic statecraft. And honestly, businesses have a way to call it protectionism if it bothers them, and to call it welcome incentives if it helps them. I mean, businesses change, right? So it's called protectionism if it works against me, and it's supportive government policy if it works for me. So I do think that there is a shift in the way businesses are expecting economic statecraft, right? On one hand, businesses are expecting giga incentives. And this didn't only happen now. Even in the Biden administration, if you remember IRA, CHIPS Act, these were mega incentives in trillions of dollars, of hundreds of billions of dollars to boost certain industries, to bring US competitiveness back in semiconductor, etc. So I think all governments, major governments who can afford it, are going to give giga incentives to their businesses to boost sectors that they consider are of national importance. Right now you're seeing giga incentives in European defense because Europe feels that defense is of national importance and they need to give incentives to their own firms. They don't just want to buy defense equipment from US, they want to create their own defense startups. So one welcome change is there are going to be giga incentives for businesses in nationally important strategic industries. Yes, on the other side, to use the word protectionism, yes, there are going to be more barriers. Not just tariff barriers, but non-tariff barriers. If you look at US's trade balance with the world, if other countries have to find a way to counter US tariffs, they have to look at non-tariff options. They can't just do it through tariffs. So Europe was considering retaliation on services at one point. Other countries are considering non-tariff limitations on investment screening. We're going to see a bit more of that. And then with that comes exceptions. That means governments are going to say, okay, you would like to invest in my country, create jobs in my country, I give an exception to you. So BYD in Hungary, for example, right? I give an exception to you. And then those exceptions are going to create workarounds in this. So one thing that I often say is I grew up in the 80s in India. And in India, we used to have this idea of license Raj. What I tell my clients is license Raj is coming to the world. And businesses need to learn how to cope with all this, this complexity. That's something we can take as a given.
Thank you, Aparna. I think we're just, Paul, do you have something very quickly to add on that?
Just 15, I think the flip side of that is this Washington consensus world we've been living in since the end of the Second World War, where we're driving tariffs down to zero and open capital markets and free trade. I think that's over, right? We're in a world, as Aparna just said, with tariffs, sanctions, non-tariff barriers, economic statecraft. We don't know where it's going to land, but that's the new world. I think the old one, we could say, you know, bye-bye to that one. I think that's gone, and we have to figure out how to navigate the new world.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Our 45 minutes are up. We haven't completely solved all the problems we wanted to, but we've made some progress. And that's thanks very much to our panelists and also to you for your questions and for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of your time here in Tianjin. Thank you very much.
Thank you.